September 11, 2001. A day that changed the course of history. A day cemented in the minds of Americans forever. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 airliners and carried out suicide attacks against targets in the United States. 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, a 3rd plane hit the Pentagon, and a 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Over 3,000 lives were lost in this tragedy. In the days and weeks following, Americans rallied together with the cry, "Never forget." Every year on this day, we mourn the lives of those lost on this tragic occasion. In Israel's history, there is a similar day, Tisha B'Av. On the 9th day of Av, usually in late July or early August, depending on the calendar, Jews throughout the world fast and mourn to remember the destruction of God's house, the temple, and God's city, Jerusalem. First in 586 by the Babylonians, and later in 70 AD by the Romans. As part of their liturgy each year, they read the book of Lamentations. In the Septuagint and later tradition, the book of Lamentations is ascribed to Jeremiah, written on the heels of Jerusalem's destruction by Babylon in the early 6th century BC. In both form and content, this book reveals the darkest hour in Israel's history. 4 of the 5 chapters are written in an acrostic, an alphabetic poem where each verse or set of verses begins with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. As in English, where we use the colloquial phrase from A to Z to stress completeness, this literary technique used in the Hebrew Bible is also used to stress completeness, here to highlight Israel's complete despair and complete ruin. Lamentations highlights that Adonai brought his people and his city to complete despair and complete ruin for their continued sin. His people look to him in hope, but the book ends with deafening silence. The first chapter contains a lament song sung over Zion and another sung by Zion, both stressing the city's complete ruin without comfort. Zion has fallen. She who was once a prominent princess, full of people, is now bereaved of her beloved and enslaved. She is now empty, no pilgrim, no people, no princes. She has been defeated and disgraced, her precious things taken and her purity defiled. In the latter part of the chapter, the city is personified. Zion calls on Adonai to see her current condition, lamenting her divinely inflicted pain. Far from unfair, she affirms Adonai's justice, admitting that her pain has resulted from her own rebellion. For her enemies who cheer rather than comfort, she asks for God's retribution. In the second chapter, the author laments Adonai's anger. He has become an enemy to Zion. No longer are his cloud and his right hand symbols of his victory for them, as in the Exodus, but now they are weapons against them. He has rejected his place and his people, destroying the temple and city, giving over the king and elders, priest and prophet. Such unpassed suffering and scorn from their enemies has produced a stream of tears. Again, the poet calls on Adonai to see the unrivaled pain of his city Zion, exemplified by their indiscriminate suffering. Both children and God's chosen servants, both young and old. In the 3rd chapter, the anonymous poet expresses his intense suffering, piling up metaphors to highlight his endless agony and Adonai's relentless attacks. Listen to this brief summary. The poet begins with a vivid description of how God ruthlessly attacked him, driving him from the light into darkness. Metaphors follow in rapid succession, each one further magnifying the horrors of divine judgment. The Lord shriveled up his skin and shattered his bone, surrounded him with hardship, put him in a dark dungeon where he was weighed down with chains, and God refused to hear his shouts for help. The Lord put obstacles in his path, mangled him like a fierce lion or bear, shot arrows into his heart, and made him a laughingstock of everyone. If this were not enough, the Lord made him eat bitter herbs, smashed his face into the gravel, and trampled him underfoot. Deprived of peace and prosperity, he reflected on his suffering. Here we see the intense, personal suffering of the author. But even amidst his suffering and God's silence, the poet rises above the present circumstances to find hope in God's character, awaiting for their future rescue. It's here we find the classic verses, "The steadfast love of Adonai never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Adonai is my portion, therefore I will hope in him." But because of his covenant love, God's correction is not forever, but it is intended to produce repentance. God is just and his discipline is appropriate. The poet calls for repentance both in attitude and action. Such intense suffering is only relieved when Adonai hears. Now, having been assured of Adonai's help, he asks for his retribution on their enemies. The fourth chapter returns to the theme of Adonai's anger against Jerusalem. Despite its privileged status, described with gold and great precious jewels, Zion's past glory was replaced by present shame. Its people scattered, its provisions scarce, and its princes impoverished. While Zion once was thought invincible, Adonai poured out his anger on Judah for their injustice. He allowed them to be taken into exile for their trust in political powers. However, Adonai will not only make his own people drink the cup of divine wrath, but also their enemies. In particular, Edom is warned that divine justice is coming. The final chapter contains a prayer for Zion. The anonymous poet cries out for Adonai to remember their shame and restore his covenant blessings. Because their land has been taken, the nation is dependent on their enemies for survival. Now they suffer atrocities, famine, rape, sorrow, and indiscriminate humiliation. Yet they acknowledge that this suffering is a result of national sin. They confess Adonai's universal reign and cry out for him to renew his covenant. The book ends with their desperate cry and God's deafening silence. Why do you forget us? Have you rejected us forever? In sum, Lamentations recounts the darkest hour in Israel's history, the destruction of Jerusalem. Both in form and content, the author laments the complete devastation and despair of the survivors. God has reversed the greatness of Zion, pouring out his wrath against the nation's sin. Hope can be found in God's loyal love and mercy. The book ends with a call for God to remember and restore his people. Was he finished with his people? Was this the end? No. But as we have learned, God is waiting for his people to turn back to him in repentance.